Well, good afternoon, good morning, everybody, depending on where you're at. My name is Will Giese. I am the Senior Director of Government Affairs for the IRA Corporation, which owns SunEarth, AET, Inter-Island Solar Supply, and a couple of other companies. I'm joined today by my colleague at SunEarth, Jessica Chrisman, who is our Manager of Marketing. And this presentation, as you can see, is about solar thermal post the Inflation Reduction Act. So today we'll be going over the Inflation Reduction Act and what we think it means for solar thermal. And I want to give the opportunity to answer anybody's questions. Just a few notes up top before we get started. So I will post my email in the chat and my contact information if you want to follow up with me afterwards. Jessica also will be available and will be moderating the conversation. So at the end of the presentation, we'll have moments for questions and answers. If anybody wants to ask any questions, you can either post it in the chat or you can be unmuted after the presentation and we'll go from there. Today's presentation is also being recorded. And so Jessica, I think we'll be able to send a copy of this recording out, post it somewhere so that folks can be able to review it if they have to step away or if they weren't able to make it. But as always, from the SunEarth and SolarArray family of corporations, consider me a resource for you on government affairs issues. That's the point of my employment here, and this is what I'm hoping to do. And today's presentation is really just kind of an overview about the Inflation Reduction Act in general and how it pertains to solar thermal. So I'm not going to be diving too deep in the weeds about some of the intricacies of the Inflation Reduction Act, and we'll go over some of that. But again, if anybody has any questions or wants to follow up, let me know. But for now, we'll go ahead and start. And Jessica, can you just nod? You can see my presentation. Yes? Great. Okay. So the big question is, and you probably all know the answer to this, what is the Inflation Reduction Act? Well, it is a law that was signed into effect on August 16th of last year by the Biden administration. It was a bipartisan law passed through the House and the Senate after months and months of negotiation, actually years of negotiation on the part of some of the portions of it. It's a huge piece of legislation that deals not just with energy, but also infrastructure. There's some Medicare stuff in there. There's lots of different vehicle credits and clean energy credits, rebates, and all kinds of things that we'll go over some of those in here. But it's a huge piece of legislation and one of the single largest investments, probably the single largest investment by the federal government in clean energy in American history. So because we are part of the clean energy industry, the Inflation Reduction Act, I think, is a crucial piece of policy for us to understand because it really is going to impact deployment and manufacturing of clean energy products, whether they be solar thermal, solar PV batteries, clean vehicles, even things like hydrogen and nuclear power will all be impacted by the different parts of the Inflation Reduction Act. Obviously, today we're going to be talking mostly about solar thermal, but know that this piece of legislation covers a wide swath of activity from the highest level of federal government all the way down to like local and tribal governments. It represents over $370 billion worth of investments over, at least a 15 to 20 year time span, or even just kind of out into the future. A 40% reduction in national greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 through a variety of different initiatives, and an increase in hundreds of thousands of new jobs, whether they be in manufacturing or development or logistics, or even people like me who do government affairs now are going to be probably a hot investment for lots of different companies just to understand the scope of this piece of legislation. So kind of focusing in on the solar thermal aspect of the IRA, there are many parts of the IRA that affect solar thermal in different ways, but there are some that are more impactful than others. So the ones that are the most impactful are things that you are probably all familiar with, things like the investment tax credit. So under the Residential Internal Revenue Code, these are covered under energy efficiency home improvement credits under 25C. And these numbers and letters are the designation for the IRS code. So if you wanted to go look at this yourself, you could. And then 25D is the residential energy property tax credit. So this is that 30% investment tax credit that folks are pretty familiar with that continues out into past 2030. And then on the commercial side, you have Section 48. Section 48 is a very large section of the Inflation Reduction Act, and it deals with all different types of clean energy deployment, typically systems under 1 megawatt. And it has kind of phases from the beginning of 2022 when the IRA passed into this kind of interim period, which we're in right now. And then it transfers for the investment tax credit into what's called a tech neutral credit, which we'll kind of discuss and what that means for solar thermal and what we're hopeful about. Interestingly, in 48, there also are credit adders. So you've probably heard a lot about these different types of credit adders within the investment tax credit. This is applicable to 48. It is things like energy community credit adders, which we'll talk about, domestic content credit adders, which Sun Earth and AET technology qualify for, manufacturing tax credits for clean energy manufacturing that are located domestically, and then things like low middle income tax credits. And then beyond those types of tax credits that affect solar thermal, there are grant and loan programs too. So things like REAP that deal with the rural electrification program, things like greenhouse gas reduction programs, where the money is kind of directly put into state and local programs that deal with greenhouse gas reduction technology, energy efficiency stuff. Think electrification methods like building out transmission and infrastructure networks, providing money to counties and tribal organizations to build out rural electrifying things. So that's kind of a whole nother pot of money that deals with just various grants and loan programs that already exist and are being expanded or that are created out of new. So let's start on the residential tax policy side. So again, this is Section 25 of the Internal Revenue Code. 25C has energy efficiency home improvement credits. They've been expanded. There's a very large focus, obviously, on heat pumps. So if you go to like NREL's website or the DOE or Energy Star's website, you probably see a lot of conversation about heat pumps, but it does include other types of energy efficiency installments. So if you're an installer that does things like solar thermal, but you also pair it with other types of technology like heat pumps, or you pair it with things like LED technology or other types of energy efficiency improvements, you can kind of combine them between the investment tax credit under 25D and these 25C credits that would apply to other applicable technologies, right? But the biggest one, I think, of all of these is the 30% tax credit under 25D for residential clean energy property. What this refers to is usually things like solar PV and storage, but also solar thermal. Solar thermal has long qualified for 25D. It is not changing, so it will continue to qualify per the schedule at the bottom of the screen. You can see the top line was the credit before the IRA was passed, and the bottom line is the credit after the IRA is passed. So as you can see, it's at 30% of your tax basis for the installed cost of that system, all the way out until it steps down in 2033 to 26%, 22% in 2034, and then to 0 in 2035. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. This tax credit itself hasn't really changed all that much for solar thermal, other than that it's been extended out, right? So it's been extended out to 2035, which is quite a long time, I would say. So it will probably be a big driver for residential installation, both on the PV side and the solar thermal side. We get a little bit more complicated when we move into the commercial sized systems, right? So a lot of systems that are installed on the mainland, not necessarily in Hawaii, but on the mainland for solar thermal are commercial sized systems, right? And so you would qualify under the 48 section for a commercial investment tax credit. But the credit itself has changed in a lot of ways. It's kind of expanded, but it also has some hooks that are attached to it. So it's not just kind of a flat 30% right off the bat. It can be 30% if you meet certain requirements, but it can also be up to 70%, depending on the type of requirements that you meet. And I'll talk about that kind of layer cake of investment tax credit bonuses that you can add under 48. But very basically, the way that this works is you have a base percentage. So that's that 2% up to 30%, depending on if you meet prevailing wage and labor requirements that are set by your state usually. Then you have an additional adder of between 2 and 10% for different types of projects, depending on where you're installing them and what you're installing them with. So you have a 10% energy community tax credit for systems that are installed in energy communities, and we'll go over what that means. And then you have a domestic content credit for systems that meet domestic content requirements. That's an additional 10%. And then not in here is if you install a system under low middle income requirements, you can qualify for up to 20% if it meets that 1.8 gigawatts of yearly allotment. So that is how you get to that 70%. But remember, to qualify for the entire base percentage of 30% or 10% of whatever credit you're claiming, you need to meet prevailing wage and labor requirements. And the IRS sets out rules for this in their rulemaking, and then prevailing wage is often determined by the state in which you install things in, unless you're installing things on tribal or federal land, and then the prevailing wage requirements are those of the federal government. But that is the way that you qualify for the full bonus percentage. So again, these are for projects under 1 megawatt. And then I think the most important thing for solar thermal, and what's not quite clear under rules, is whether solar thermal technology qualifies post 2025 under the tech neutral credit. So what happens at the beginning of 2025 is that the credit kind of transfers to, incentivizing, I think what the statute hopefully means to say is a kind of a larger swath of clean energy technology, but it isn't explicit about what type of clean energy technology it may or may not include. It is explicit about some, for instance, solar PV and storage are pretty explicit, but it's not explicit about others. So one of the things that I do in my job for Solar Ray is talk with folks like the IRS and say, hey, we think that solar thermal qualifies under the energy storage provision within Section 48 after 2025. And we're hopeful that the IRS, basically it will be down to the IRS to make a rules determination on whether a system will qualify, right? So they don't necessarily say it doesn't, and they don't necessarily say it does. But the other thing you should remember too about this when you're kind of thinking about risk for systems installed after 2025 is, well, heat pump manufacturers also don't necessarily qualify, but they're also asking for the same kind of qualification in the same way that solar thermal is, right? So we're hopeful that by the end of this year, the IRS will release a rules determination that will kind of inform whether or not we qualify for this Section 48 credit post 2025. And I think we'll probably have another maybe shorter conference or seminar for you who are attending this when we have that determination. I'm happy to set those up and we can talk about that. But we're advocating for it right now. We've spoken with the IRS, we continue an open dialogue, and there's lots of players asking kind of the same thing. So, the IRS gets comments about this every single day, and they have yet to release their rules. So we're hopeful, but just know that, if you're installing things before 2025, you're in the clear, right? You qualify for these tax credits, easy peasy, it's pretty explicit. After 2025, we need a determination from the IRS. So that's the big split. And then under 48C, if you're a manufacturer, potentially you get a manufacturing tax credit, although that tax credit does not apply to certain technologies, right? Solar thermal being one of them. So although we are a domestic manufacturer of renewable energy goods and we meet that content guideline, we don't necessarily meet the manufacturing tax credit guideline, but other technology does, right? So if SunEarth decided to get in the business of PV manufacturing, for instance, and we wanted to open up a PV manufacturing plant, we would qualify for that manufacturing tax credit. And those rules are written. So if you're a business and you're thinking about doing some type of manufacturing, potential is that there is a tax credit out for you to help kind of offset the initial cost of that manufacturing plant. Okay. Probably the most confusing thing about the 48 tax credit is this concept of energy communities. So energy communities is a new definition. It exists within the statute under the IRS rules, and it's basically one of three different things. And the three things are right here. I pulled them right from the DOE's website. This is the statutory definition of what an energy community is, and it is either a brownfield site. So think of like an EPA designated brownfield site. I used to go to the University of Tennessee, and part of that facility at UT in Knoxville was built on an old ammunition manufacturing plant, that is a brownfield site, right? So there are certain rules about things that you can build. Or think about a retired mountaintop removal mining coal facility, right? You can't build everything on that top of that mountain, but you can build some things, including solar thermal potentially. And then the second definition would be a metropolitan statistical area that has one of two things: a 0.17% or greater direct employment or 25% or greater local tax revenue collection related to the extraction, processing, transport, or storage of coal, oil, or natural gas. So if you're basically a fossil fuel community, you would qualify for that. Or it has an unemployment rate at or above the national average unemployment rate for the previous year. So these are things like low middle income communities, if you think about it in that way. And then the third part is a census tract in which a coal mine has closed after 1999. So think places like West Virginia, where lots of coal mine closures happen. And you can see on the map all that red dot right there in the Appalachian Mountains. Those are a bunch of coal mine closures. Or a coal-fired generating power plant has closed and the surrounding community itself used to be employed by that coal mine and now no longer are because it's been retired. That is an energy community. So places in Hawaii, for instance, the AES plant closed down last year. And so the census tract where it was located is an energy community, and all the adjoining census tracts around it are also energy communities. So if you look at this map, what that means is basically the dark orange areas are places where coal mines or coal fields have shut down at that timeline, and then the light yellow areas are the areas around where people might have been employed who no longer are employed because of those fossil fuel or coal extractions. And then the purple parts are these metropolitan statistical areas. There's another map for brownfield sites, but the EPA is kind of developing that map and it's not overlaid yet on this one. But if you wanted to go look, you can just type in DOE energy community in Google and this map will come up. So if you're developing a project in, Louisville, Kentucky, right? You look on the map, oh, it's in an energy community. So boom, you meet prevailing wage requirements. You qualify for a 10% adder on top of that base 30% adder, right? So that's what that means. That's what an energy community is in a nutshell. These are just other credits and programs in brief. There's actually a pretty good link on the White House's website that goes through, it's got like a 300-page guide on the IRA that you can download if you really wanted to look where to find these things and which department is responsible. I pulled out some of the ones that are most relative to solar thermal, but this is just the tip of the iceberg for things that are in the IRA that affect clean energy in mass. So obviously, we have the investment tax credit up there. We have the greenhouse gas reduction fund. So this is money in competitive grants that's coming from the federal government to localities, specifically aimed at lowering greenhouse gas emissions in low income and disadvantaged communities. Potentially, that could be money that could fund green banking programs, for instance, or loan risk offset programs, or on-bill financing programs that could include solar thermal potentially as a technology that could be funded. You have the energy loans program. So this is new clean energy technologies, innovative clean energy technologies that are being developed. So think R&D. So if you have an idea, so Jessica has a brilliant idea for a new sun earth solar thermal product that's never seen the market before, you could qualify for a loan potentially from the program if you meet certain requirements. And then some of the more interesting ones that I think are ripe for potential are rural electric loans or the Rural Energy for America program. So think electrifying rural America, right? For a long, long time, I live in Virginia right now. So, if you go out in Southwest Virginia, it's all farms, and those energy infrastructure ecosystems that exist in those areas have not been updated in years, right? It's very expensive to update transmission and interconnection. And yet those are the areas where a lot of solar PV or solar thermal could potentially be built en masse, right? Land is cheap out there, siting is relatively easy. And so the these rural programs are meant to help offset that cost for, an agricultural plot owner to install solar on their land, potentially, whether it's for solar thermal systems that are being installed in a chicken plant for solar heating, right? Or some type of, I was reading an article the other day about solar thermal being used for industrial heat processing for biogas, right? Like if you wanted to start a biogas plant out somewhere in Utah, you could do that if you qualify for these rural loans. And the loans themselves are guaranteed by the federal government. They're usually very low interest. So if you have customers, especially who are agricultural landowners or in the agricultural business, chances are that they might qualify for something like this. So might want to think about the different areas of funding that you could get for your project. And then the new energy efficiency home credits. So this is separate from just energy efficiency in general. This has to do with new home building, but it's an offset of credits for Energy Star related projects, which include solar thermal, which is an Energy Star. Some solar thermal, including Southern products, are Energy Star rated products. So those also are included in the energy efficiency home credit if you're a new home developer. We covered the energy efficiency changes a little bit. Again, I think the best bang for your buck for residential is going to be under 25D for the tax credit. But there is other energy efficiency money out there, especially some grant and rebate programs that will be distributed by the federal government to state energy offices, to Indian tribes, other utility funded EE rebate programs, which we know really drive solar thermal adoption. So think of things like the Hawaii Energy Program or SoCal Gas. Texas has programs. There's a lot of gas utilities out there that have a lot of solar thermal rebates. So potentially, they could double their rebate program if they're getting money from the federal government through some of these grants, right? So that's something that I would be advocating for. If I speak with a utility and say, hey, it's time for an energy efficiency program update, why don't you think about the offerings that you have for solar thermal? And by the way, here's a bunch of money from the federal government through the IRA for you to fund energy efficiency programs, right? And, just a little kind of analysis on my part, the thing that I think about a lot is the United States, through the IRA and through other energy policy in general, is moving towards total electrification, which means that gas companies are kind of on the chopping block in some ways. But in my mind, gas companies always kind of build themselves as a bridge fuel to renewable energy. But in my mind, solar thermal is kind of a bridge fuel for gas into total electrification. And I think, one of my pitches to some gas companies is, hey, you guys are fighting this electrification issue here. Why not pair your systems with solar thermal, lower your greenhouse gas emissions, potentially lower than some electric utilities if all their electricity is coming from fossil fuels? We get to benefit as the solar thermal industry. The gas industry gets to benefit because they're still signing up customers and gas stuff. And the planet gets to benefit because greenhouse gas reductions are going down, right? So one way to think about some of these funds going from energy efficiency programs into things like gas utilities is that's not necessarily a bad thing for us. We just need to go out and market it as a solar thermal industry. Hey, we are a technology that can be paired with existing gas or new, more efficient gas. We can be paired with heat pumps. We can be standalone. We can be installed in residential or commercial or industrial areas. Our biggest problem is that hot water gets too hot, right? That's our biggest issue for solar thermal, not that it's not going to work. So we have success in these programs, and I think this is a really good opportunity to go and try and push for expanded ones or new ones that exist in utilities that haven't thought about it. All right. So I'm not going to go through this whole slide, but this is really just a comparison to, a lot of different energy programs that existed before the Inflation Reduction Act was passed and then after, right? So you see after the Inflation Reduction was passed, you have massive expansions to investment tax credits. You've got expansions to funding, research, loan, and grant opportunities at all levels of government, even down to local and tribal levels, and co-ops, right? One thing about the tax credit that changed is that now there's a direct pay option for non-governmental industries or organizations, think churches, think cities and counties, will now use the investment tax credit through direct pay. They get an actual check from the federal government for their tax credit the following year that they install a system, right? That's a huge incentive for counties to start installing lots of renewable energy, hopefully some solar thermal, right? So that direct pay now exists because of the IRA, and that will change the game, I think, for a lot of nonprofits and non-taxable entities that usually kind of had to go through a bunch of hurdles to get some of that money or some benefit from that money, right? I was just talking to somebody the other day who runs the libraries in a town in Arkansas, and she's very interested now in receiving or getting renewable energy on their libraries because their electrical load and their hot water load surprisingly is very big, and now she can claim that directly as a tax benefit through direct pay. So think about that too when you're talking to your consumers. We talked about new tax credits for manufacturing, transmission, and interconnection. That's what TX and IX mean. I think that's more important from the PV side of things to help kind of build out the electrical grid to take more generation in different places. But I think it's also an opportunity for solar thermal because what we do is we reduce load, right? So, you can take a lot of money that you would otherwise be spending to build out transmission and interconnection and spend it on reducing hot water load, reducing electrical or gas load through that massive amount of solar thermal. And you're saving money here, putting it somewhere else, right? And then there's energy efficiency and weatherization programs, kind of a always around. And then, like I said, nonprofit, state, and local governments can now receive direct pay. There's a massive push for indigenous and tribal land development, which traditionally hasn't gotten a lot of renewable energy development. And low middle income is a huge focus as well of the IRA, and lots of different low middle income policies show up. All right, this is in a nutshell what I was talking about, right? On the right, you have this clean energy layer cake for 48. So you start with this base investment tax credit, the bottom layer, low-income residential projects for 20%, 10% domestic content bonus, and a 10% energy community bonus for a potential total of 70%. So in this example, if your system costs $1 million, you could be getting back $700,000, right? 70% of the value if you qualify for all of these different layers. I think the issue right now that a lot of developers are having is kind of looking at areas in which they would qualify for some or all of these layers. Remember too that the low income 20% is limited. It's cap limited at right now 1.8 gigawatts a year. And there are certain requirements that you must meet to be qualified for that low middle income program. But that again is posted on the IRS's website, and I'm happy and I've answered a lot of questions for our customers about what this would look like and how to qualify for it and what are the rules. Obviously, if you're doing any of this types of systems, I encourage you to, contact a CPA who's familiar with this and a tax attorney, especially if they're really big projects, commercial projects. I think that would always behoove you to do it, but I can very much give you the information and the tools so that you can go and start looking at these projects yourself if you want. On the left-hand side, we've got where is all that money going, right? We talked about that over $300 billion. So as you can see, almost half of that pie right there is renewable energy tax credits going to things like solar and wind and production tax credits. And if we're talking about production tax credits, that's usually things like utility scale solar PTCs or wind PTCs. But then the other half of it are all different kinds of little pots of money that are going all over the place, right? Clean manufacturing, 36 billion. Energy efficiency, 36 billion. Nuclear energy, getting another 30 billion, right? And you've got EVs, hydrogen, alternative fuels, carbon capture, and clean energy cost recovery, right? And I think utility run programs get cost recovery for stuff. So that just kind of gives you a sense of, this huge pot of money, where's it all going? A lot of it is going to go into solar, right? So my goal is to get a piece of that. And that's a big, big piece. Even if it's a little slice of that big chunk, $1 billion is a lot. So what does it mean to have the IRA? So obviously, we're just 1 year in. We had our year anniversary of the IRA passing in August of this year. But you could see folks at SIA, who I used to work with, they're projecting lots of solar deployment. Obviously, that's what they do. They're a trade association. They're always going to project that kind of stuff. But you also have banks like Credit Suisse, Goldman Sachs, CBO saying, you're going to get money savings, you're going to create jobs, and you're going to inject money into the economy. So they see that as a good thing. And remember, these are the banks that are going to be loaning money out to finance these projects. So if they're looking at the IRA and they're saying, wow, this is going to give us a ton of money, this is going to inject a lot of money into the economy, they're probably thinking the same way I'm thinking of, how am I going to get some of that money? So the other thing too is that hopefully it will create jobs. And I think we've already seen that it has started creating jobs, right? You see the Biden administration going in the last 6 months to the Enphase facility, the Q Cells facility in Atlanta, all these manufacturers that are starting to move from their overseas operation domestically so that they can meet that domestic content guideline. And remember, right now, Sun Earth and AET are one of the few companies that really do meet that domestic content guideline, right? Our solar thermal collectors meet the guidelines that the IRS currently posted for the most part. I think actually they all do. If we went through it. But anyway, we meet those domestic guidelines already. We've been meeting them since the 70s. They just didn't exist then. So we're ahead of the game for solar thermal. So if somebody wanted to start installing these types of things today for solar thermal, you would meet those domestic content guidelines with Sun Earth and AET products. But the point is that there's going to be lots of new manufacturing domestically onshore. It's going to create lots of jobs. It's going to create a lot of money into the economy, and it's going to make it so that you can get that extra 10% if you're developing products. So we talked a little bit about this as I was going through the presentation. I'm kind of focusing on, what I'm working on at the IRA Corporation, but it's things like getting that clarification on 48 for tech neutral to make sure that solar thermal is included, because solar thermal is one of the oldest technologies that's been pushed by the federal government. There's lots of precedent to continue having it in there, and we think that it is part of it. So we're going to continue to push for that after 2025 so that you all have, you're insured so that you have confidence to go and invest in these systems on the commercial scale in the US and get that sweet 70% tax credit. We continue to reach out to state and local agencies. I have calls every week with utilities, with localities, with state governments about including solar thermal. I know that heat pumps are what's hot right now, but excuse the pun, but solar thermal has been part of a lot of programs for decades, right? And they still are in those programs, and they do qualify for all these different types of incentives, right? It makes sense for localities to continue to push them, for utilities to continue to expand their programs for it. So my job, part of it, is going out to these localities and saying, hey guys, the IRA includes solar thermal. Our equipment works really, really well. Here are some programs that have worked really well too. Here's how you could improve them. It's easy to set them up, right? So I'm hopeful that, places that normally don't have a lot of solar thermal can now use some of this money to start building out that development, right? Like the Carolinas, like Indiana, like out west, that's not in California, but also California, even places like Puerto Rico, right, could use a lot of solar thermal, and there's some money for the IRA in places like Puerto Rico as well. And then in the long term, having solar thermal and that manufacturing tax credit from our perspective would be a good thing. We can continue building domestic stuff, but we're going to meet that domestic guideline, probably till I retire or die, because we're not going to be moving our manufacturing out of country. And then advocacy on existing EE programs to include solar thermal, right? Vermont, for instance, just passed a new guideline about heat, and they have a new kind of carbon reduction heat requirement that they passed this year. It does include solar thermal. They're going to start rulemaking it on this year. So that would be a good thing for me to get in to advocate for. If you are interested in Vermont, that'd be something to go to. New York, for instance, has something like this. The Carolinas has the Carbon Reduction Act. North Carolina does. So there's all kinds of stuff out there, and there's all kinds of opportunities for solar thermal. I think it's incumbent on us as the industry to say our products work really well. They've worked really well for a really long time. They're American made, and we're good to go. You just need to have a program that has it. So that will be what I will be focusing my time in the solar thermal industry for Solar Ray for a while. So I guess when you guys are out there, whether you're developing things or you're buying products or you're kind of thinking about moving into a new market, just keep in the back of your mind that I'm here. I'm happy to help to the extent that I can. And, information is useless if it's not shared. So if I'm the only one who knows any of this stuff, it's not valuable to anybody. So consider me a resource in that case and just try to give you an idea of what I'll be doing. Okay, so that kind of brings us to the end. It's a relatively short presentation. Again, this was really just an overview. I'll stop sharing my screen here. Oop, lost you. So, again, I'll post my details in the chat here if you ever have any questions, whether you want to ask them here, or you want to kind of think about it and email me later or give me a call. I'm totally free to do that. But again, the IRA is a huge piece of legislation. All of the parts of it haven't quite been figured out yet. So, the IRS, for instance, is still engaging in rulemaking on various parts. So, there's lots of kind of unanswered questions that still exist. But, should be good. I'm very hopeful about it. I think it's going to spur a lot of clean energy investment, especially for us and for you all, create more business and make more money for you guys. And I think that's what it's all about. We're saving the planet, we're making money. It's all good. Okay, so I think, Jessica, unless you had anything you wanted to say, I might answer some questions. I already see one in here.
There is one that popped up. I did go ahead and throw the domestic content guidelines up that are both listed for Sun Earth and AET products that meet that in the chat for reference. And yes, there does look like to be one question from Peter. Will, if you can explain how direct pay works for nonprofits.
Yeah, sure. So it's very simple, and I'm actually pulling up the hyperlink here where you can see it. Oh, my computer froze. Of course it did. So previously, before the IRA happened, nonprofits, right? Think your 501c3s or churches that owned property could not claim tax benefits because they're a non-taxable entity, right? And so there was some justification about why they couldn't claim things. Things like cities too, that don't pay taxes in the same way, couldn't claim stuff like that. But the IRA changed it. So, and it's very simple. It's basically if you are one of these non-taxable entity and you install something that would otherwise qualify for Section 48 or Section 25D, although it probably wouldn't because it's a residential tax credit, you now qualify for direct pay. And what that means is that you get the percentage value of that asset that you've installed that qualifies for a tax credit in a check, like cash money check paid to you by the federal government, right? So if I am a city and I have a building and I install a $1 million system on my building and I qualify for, let's say, a 30% tax credit. In 2024, I install it, I do my taxes, and in 2025, I have submitted for that direct pay, and there's a really easy way to do it. I posted it here. You get a check for 30% of the value of that system the next year in 2025. So that is pretty simply how it works. Again, I'm not a tax professional, so I would encourage folks to reach out to CPAs and tax professionals to kind of give you the ins and outs of all this. But if you look at the way that direct pay works on the IRS's website, that's basically what they say is you qualify, you get a check.
Looks like he comes back with a question saying a complete 30% for commercial still applies as a base in the IRA?
No, so kind of. If you meet prevailing wage and labor requirements, you get the base of 30%. If you don't, you get a base of 2%, right? So in order to qualify for the entire percentage amount of either the bonus percentage that you're applying for or the base, you have to meet prevailing wage and labor requirements, right? And chances are, I think most people will meet them. You're leaving money on the table if you don't. But the base itself is that 30% or 2% if you don't meet prevailing wage and labor requirements. And then every other bonus on top of that also must meet the same prevailing wage requirements. But if you're meeting it for the base, you're meeting it for everything else. So if you qualify for that 30%, you're qualifying for 10% domestic content if you're using domestic content, and then 10% energy community if you're there.
What about the DoD? Does it apply for direct pay?
Carlos, is that the Department of Defense? I assume. Since it's a federal entity, if you're talking about the Department of Defense, I honestly don't know. My gut says that they don't qualify for that. This is really, the direct pay is really meant for cities and counties, tribal governments, religious organizations, nonprofits. There's a whole list of them in the IRS that I can try and bring up, or I can follow up in an email to participants afterwards on who they're talking about when they're talking about this direct pay. So I'm not sure if the DoD is one of those qualifying entities because they're a federal government. But I will look into it and see if I can find the answer to that one. It's a good question.
Yeah, direct pay is turning out to be a hot topic here. It'd be great if you could include that in the information for follow-up, Will.
Yeah, of course.
Looks like you're speaking that the installing company has to qualify for the customer buying to get the 30% right.
Installing
I'm not
company has
sure.
to qualify. Sorry, Peter, I don't really understand that question. Can you qualify? Like, are you saying they have to qualify? The installing company, yeah. So if you're talking about things like labor and wage requirements, the installing company would need to qualify for that prevailing wage. The customer ultimately is going to be the one asking for the tax credit, but the system that's been installed has to meet prevailing wage and labor requirements, which would mean that the developing company that's hiring the labor to do that would have to do so under prevailing wage and labor for the state or the area that they're doing it. So, I mean, ultimately, it's the asset owner who's going to be qualifying for that tax benefit, but they have to make sure that whoever's installing it, whether it's them or somebody else, has to meet those requirements. I can send the slides in a PDF, or Jessica can in follow-up. That's super easy.
Yes, Dana, the link will go out after the fact. It will be posted to YouTube, the actual recording of this presentation, and if you'd like, we can include the slides as well. We've got another question coming in from Curtis. Curtis would also like the slides.
No
Wonderful.
Problem. Any other questions? Let me post while we're waiting, if you want to type a question out or raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll post my email here where you can reach me. So one other thought I have is we're always, I work in government affairs. I'm a policy guy. I've done policy, solar policy for over a decade. So I'm always happy to do different types of presentations about different things that people find valuable. So, if you have any feedback on this or other things that you'd like to learn more about, like, hey, I want to do a deep dive in the REAP program or the rural electrification program, I'm happy to do something like that as well. And I'm sure Jessica would be happy to help me set that up. But I will make sure to follow up with some of the questions that have been answered here. If you have any other topics you'd like me to discuss, let me know. When things happen that I think are relevant to the industry for the IRA, whether the IRS releases clarification on a big thing, I think we'll probably have a quick update to this. I'm happy to share my slides anytime. And again, feel free to shoot me an email. Oh, I see Carlos has a question again. All right, Carlos. Deep dive for commercial applications. I agree.
I believe we've already done one last year. A deep dive on commercial applications should be listed on the Sun-Earth YouTube channel, but we can always revamp it and bring another one to light if necessary.
And Jessica, I don't know if you can unmute Carlos. We can do that.
Attempting to.
Sorry,
I cannot seem to unmute you. 1 second.
Okay. I hate to do this to you, Carlos, but if you want to type it out, I would appreciate it.
Hold on, we're gonna.
No, you're good. Oh, wait, I think you can unmute now.
There you go. That works.
There you go.
Hey guys, thank you for the great presentation. Just real quick, it's really more an observation than a question. Maybe I've been applying to some of the rural facilities with solar thermal projects for different applications, which are very relevant in rural communities. And we are getting the projects denied by the funds. I mean, they're not finding the solar thermal solutions attractive.
Like the customers aren't.
No, not the customers. So it's on the grant programs. It's $1 billion out there in grants for rural facilities. For rural,
Okay, like the
energy.
rural loans program,
Yeah. Well, it's not on loans. It's actually on grants.
the REAP ones.
They're not REAPs. It's a different program.
Okay, well, how about this? I'm happy to reach out to the Department of Agriculture. I think it would be relevant if you can send it to me what program that you guys are applying under.
Yeah, I'll have a look. I mean, it's just if we can get away to that, because I think a lot of the people that are reading these things sort of see solar thermal as legacy technology, and they thinking, and everybody's just all obsessed about electrifying everything, which of course is not going to work. But and somehow we need to start advocating for wait. There's a big chunk of the problem that's just thermal, and there's also low-grade heat thermal. So, and we have technology made in the US that can already tackle that in a commercially viable way. So, I mean, they're not seeing it. That's what I'm telling you.
Okay, well, that's something that I can bark up somebody's tree until they pay attention to me about. So if you've got even just the program itself, that you're willing to share with me, I'm happy to follow up on that from our side. I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, I'll make that happen.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Good flag.
Any other final questions, guys? And gals that are on here? I go with no. Some great questions. Thank you again, Will, for taking the time today to explain this much, further for us. And I will include his information in the email that goes out should anyone want to send Will a direct message or bring something to light that he might not be aware of on behalf of thermal and all renewable energy. Thanks again, Will. We'll talk soon, guys.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Have a great day.